Good evening. My name is Sebastian Warwick and I'm the Executive Director of Wiltshire Creative. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the Civic Society's annual open meeting, which this year has been organised in partnership with Salisbury City Council's Neighbourhood Plan team and Wiltshire Creative. The open meeting is traditionally a mix of information giving and a discussion with a panel of experts. Tonight, inspired by Salisbury 2020 Big Weekend, What Next for the City discussion held back in May, we want to explore new ways of thinking and consider opportunities for doing things differently when planning for the future development of Salisbury. We'll be exploring some of the impacts of the trends which are being accelerated by COVID, such as the significant increase in online shopping and in working from home, the way in which high streets in towns and cities across the country are already experiencing change, and at the same time, how people are appreciating the important benefits of community, staying at home, staying local, and connecting with nature. We hope our panel, with their different backgrounds and experience, will inform, challenge, and encourage us to be radical in our thinking. After the presentations, our panelists will consider some of the comments and questions that we hope you, the audience, will raise using the question and answer function. This can be done at any point during the event. So, without further ado, let me introduce our panel. I'd like to now ask our panel to turn on their cameras. So first, I'd like to introduce Andrea Pellegrin. Andrea is a town planner who's had senior local government and management experience of complex applications in the private sector. She currently specialises in supporting communities to develop their neighbourhood plans. She'll explain what a neighbourhood plan is and how a community has to set out its vision for the next 10 to 15 years to ensure the right types of developments happen in the right places. She'll also explain what stage the Salisbury Neighbourhood Plan has got to and what the likely programme is going forward. Next, we have Friedrich Ludwig, who is a director at Acme, an award-winning architects firm with offices in London, Berlin, and Melbourne. Acme is involved in a diverse range of work from palaces to parks, offices to museums, bridges to department stores, and car parks to power stations, but has a particular focus on city centres. He naturally thinks outside the box, and his contention is that COVID-19 is fueling the already serious crisis that was threatening retail and the future of the high street. We have David Dolman, who is development manager at Hacer Developments. Hacer is a development and investment company with many years' experience of delivering residential, commercial, as well as mixed-use regeneration projects that are bringing nature into the heart of the urban environment. A prime example of this is the Biophilic Living Project in central Swansea. David will describe the background and context for this pioneering project, which is being seen by the Welsh Government as a valuable model for changing people's perceptions of urban living and addressing social issues such as the decline in communities and the effect of loneliness in society. The Managing Director of Hacer Developments, Carwyn Davies, will be joining our panelists for the discussion as the discussion part of this meeting. And last but certainly not least is Andrew Nixon of Powell Dobson Architects, who leads the Biophilic Living Project design team. Established in 1966, Powell Dobson is an architectural practice with offices in Cardiff, London, and Swansea. Their approach to urban design focuses on the creation of sustainable places based on placemaking principles that help regenerate communities and the environment. Andrew Nixon will take us through the details of the Biophilic Living Project and explain the challenges as well as the opportunities for widening the parameters of building design and forging innovative partnerships and looking to the long term. In a moment, each member of the panel will speak on their topic for 10 minutes. After this, I'll open the discussion out to questions and comments from the audiences, and we'll be joined by Councillor Jeremy Nettle, leader of Salisbury City Council, who knows Salisbury extremely well, and also by David Dolman's colleague, Carwyn Davies, who, as I've mentioned already, is Managing Director of Hacer Developments. Please remember, you can submit questions whenever you want via the question and answer function, and the panel will address as many of them as they can. If anyone has any technical problems, please email support@wiltshirecreative.co.uk and we'll try and resolve them. That's support@wiltshirecreative.co.uk. So, without further ado, I'll now ask our panelists to speak for 10 minutes on their chosen topic. Andrea, can I ask you to speak first?
Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. My name is Andrea Pellegram. I'm a chartered town planner, and I have been since 1991. I know I don't sound like an English town planner, but I do have all my work experience here. And I have, throughout the course of my career, worked in local government and worked in the private sector. And now I'm working almost solely with local communities to help them actually work within the planning system. Now, there's been a major change in how planning allows communities to engage in the system, which has always been a very top-down system. And now we have neighborhood plans, and that is what I am helping Salisbury City Council prepare. We have a wonderful, skilled steering group made, mostly of local people like Nicola Lipscomb, who's actually set this up today. Local people who feel passionate about Salisbury, who love it and who want it to be as good as it can be in the future. And we are in a pivotal time now. Not only do we have COVID, we have climate change, but we also have changes in our working patterns and our shopping patterns. And all of a sudden, many of the structures that we had in our urban environment are no longer fit for purpose. And we know how these changes play out over time. We know, for instance, in Salisbury that many of the streets were originally made for horses and carts, and now it's difficult to actually get cars and lorries through them. Well, those same sorts of changes are going to happen to us now. So what the neighborhood plan is trying to do is to work within this context of change and actually come up with some policies that will guide development in the future. Now, the situation in Salisbury is quite special because, unfortunately, the incident, the Novichok incident, really caused severe problems for the tourism and retail industry. Wiltshire Council has realized that this is something that requires immediate attention. So Wiltshire Council have actually focused a lot of energy and resource on Salisbury, trying to understand it. So in the last year, they've come up with plans for river park improvements in the center of Salisbury, which deals partially with biodiversity and flood management, but also with recreation. The central area framework, which is trying to rejuvenate the town center after the whole COVID incident, but also to make it a little bit more attractive for the tourism industry. There are proposals for improvements at Fisherton Street and just a wider range of traffic proposals in and outside of the city. So within this context, the neighborhood plan is being prepared, and we're trying to work with the work that Wiltshire Council has already done, but we're trying to do it in a way that's led by the Salisbury community, which I have to say is very difficult in times of COVID when we're not allowed to actually go out and meet with you. So I'm delighted to be doing this tonight because I think this is an innovative way to actually get a message across and hopefully start a dialogue with the community. What we're focusing on with the neighborhood plan is we're trying to look at sustainability writ large. How do we make the Salisbury City fit for the future with climate change in mind, and also with probably a disease that is going to be with us for a while, and we're going to have changed living patterns. We're looking at housing and how we can increase the amount of affordable housing. We're looking specifically at housing for younger people to try to address the demographic imbalance where we have quite a lot of older people in Salisbury, but not enough young people, and it's because they can't afford to live here. So we're trying to find ways, innovative ways, challenging ways of having more affordable housing. We're looking very specifically also at the green spaces in Salisbury, which are delightful and plentiful. And I very much enjoyed myself last week when I walked around many of your parks in the town center, and we did site visits, and I saw many of the green corridors that radiate from the city center into your countryside. making it a special place that's green and urban at the same time. You're so lucky to live in such a beautiful place. We're also looking at issues around transport and parking, and we're asking difficult questions like, do we need as much parking? Should we maybe not accommodate so many cars in the town center in favor of more housing in the center? What would this perhaps do something to improve the nighttime economy? Would it improve the demographic profile? Would it bring a different kind of life to the economy? There's all sorts of interesting questions that we're asking ourselves right now. And to this end, we've gone out to the public for a call for sites, asking for sites that developers might wish to progress through the neighborhood plan. And that's what we were doing last week. We were looking at sites, and we're hoping that we can either help develop some difficult sites that have been brownfield sites for a long time, come up with something innovative that's of value to the whole community. But we're also hoping that we can introduce more housing, as I said. And in this process, we're looking mainly at the town center, but also at the outside. And we're looking at the linkages. And those are mainly the green linkages, but they're also the economic linkages and the transport linkages to the surrounding area. So as you can imagine, it's a very difficult project. Normally neighborhood plans are for tiny villages. This one is for a city of 52,000 people. In a very, as I said, a very complex economic and social policy context. So we're just now starting to get to the point, and we have been working on this for a year and a half, where we really starting to understand what we want to achieve. We hope that we're going to have some draft policies in the spring, and then we will be consulting widely with you. Hopefully we can work with maybe with Wiltshire Creative to do some consultation before then to actually help you tell us what you want to have in these policies and what you think will work for your future. Just to let you know a little bit about the process, neighborhood planning isn't all lovely, fluffy, we get to do whatever we want. Oh no, it's planning policy just like all the rest of it. And we have very strict limitations in what we can do, all set out in the National Planning Policy Framework, but also we must be in conformity with the policies in the local plan set by Wiltshire Council. So we've got a lot of policy constraints that we have to adhere to. To that end, it goes through consultation with you as a community first, then we make sure that that's all taken into account. Then it goes out to another consultation run by Wiltshire Council to make sure with the statutory consultees like the Environment Agency, the Highways Authority, the Highways Agency, Natural England, Historic England, that they're satisfied. Then it goes to an examination where once again it is tested. And finally, after all of those tests, it goes out to you in the community to vote in a referendum whether you wish to have this as your neighborhood plan or not. And it is a simple majority. So it's up to you, really. It is all up to you whether this becomes your policy for the future. So I hope tonight that we can talk about that and what we want to do with the future. And also I hope that we can have a little bit of thought about the very significant changes that the government is proposing in the way we look at planning in response to COVID, in response to funding for the private sector and the public sector. And also climate change, the most important thing of all, how we are going to address climate change. And all of this is addressed in national policy, which is changing significantly. Thank you, Sebastian. That's me for an introduction.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was really useful and really interesting. And I know people will have many comments and questions about it. I really appreciate that opening presentation. I'd now like to turn to Friedrich Ludwig. Friedrich, would you like to speak on your chosen topic?
Thanks, Sebastian. I will share my screen for a couple of very brief slides. By way of introduction, thank you for inviting me. I think I work for a company called Acme. We are not retail specialists only, but it's fair to say we've done a fair share of retail in the last 15 years. And I think there was a time 15 years ago when you wanted to kind of regenerate your town center, you would think of retail as the answer to your questions. And so this, for example, was a scheme we've done for Hammerson, working very closely with Southampton City Council, who wanted a new city square, who wanted to get people down to the medieval town wall, and wanted to really kind of regenerate this kind of key part next to the high street. And I think we've made a good business for quite some time out of taking kind of developers' ideas about shopping centers and trying to make them architecturally a little bit more complex, making them a little bit more kind of urban elements that really kind of work with the city fabric. But I think the last really big scheme we've done probably is Leeds City Centre with large developer, also in close conjunction with Leeds City Council, who were also absolutely adamant that the way to kind of regenerate and extend the town centre of Leeds would be to have a John Lewis, and nothing in life would ever happen in Leeds if you don't have a John Lewis. Now, they didn't actually have a John Lewis, and that was the last big gap in the John Lewis portfolio. But I did say to the John Lewis board at the time when we won the competition that I think I am building a dinosaur. And they looked at me extremely upset and said, why are you calling us kind of builders of dinosaurs? And I kind of tried to say, I don't think there would be another one of these really big 6-story full-line department stores, in my lifetime. 3 years later, the store opened, and John Lewis announced pretty shortly afterwards that they will never ever build a building as big as this one ever again. And I think what that was symptomatic about is kind of the way retail works has just changed so much in the last 10 years that even before COVID, a building like this wouldn't really happen again anymore, because what this building represents to John Lewis was something which kind of said, this is a full line John Lewis. Every single thing you can buy at John Lewis is in this store. John Lewis are now making 45% of their whole national turnover online. It was 20 when this building was built. And John Lewis just announced that they would like to do 60% of their turnover online kind of in about 2 years' time. And I think what that's representing is just how much retail is changing even before COVID. This is now 3 years ago, and that kind of is the scale of change that we've seen in that. And so the last one I would just show you kind of, which is I think our first proper failure in that regards, is this scheme was a couple of years later. Chester, so not totally dissimilar in terms of beauty and kind of size to kind of Salisbury. Chester also were adamant that the way to regenerate Chester city centre and save the high street would be to have a House of Fraser. And we tried to explain to Chester that there's a life beyond department stores and that we don't think retail is really the savior of kind of city centers in that sense anymore. Chester didn't quite listen to us. House of Fraser, as you all know, went into kind of bankruptcy and kind of never quite emerged from that again. So clearly this scheme has hit the buffers and will not in that form ever see the light again. And I think what that really kind of says to us is kind of we do need to think very differently about retail going forward. This idea that retail is a thing in itself that has power and that is an anchor that would make people do something, I think is very much a time that won't come back. And what COVID has accelerated very much is the idea that kind of retail is something on life support that we need to be very careful about as to kind of how do we preserve what we have and how do we kind of work around with that. So I think I won't kind of dwell too much on any project in particular, but just to kind of say, for example, if developer came to us and said, this is a big site in Dublin, and Dublin clearly has kind of, quite a bit of more, let's say, kind of footfall and firepower than kind of smaller regional cities in the UK. And that's the old scheme they had with a big department store and lots of shops on the ground floor, nothing sitting above that. And what we said to kind of the developer and what the developer kind of came to conclusion is retail isn't really a profit driver anymore going forward. We really need to rethink what actually makes the scheme work. So what we've done with the developers is say it needs to become a mixed-use scheme. We really need to find ways of introducing residential and offices in city centres. And that's nothing to do with Dublin. That's something that we're doing in Swansea, that we're doing in Folkestone, that we're doing in many other cities in the UK and internationally. So say we must find a way to have people working in town centres in a really diverse set of office spaces. We need to be kind of restoring our streets again, and the streets shouldn't be shopping centers. They're probably proper streets that people are happy to walk, and that means we need to get rid of the cars. So we've removed 3,000 car parking spaces from the scheme. We've changed it from 100% retail to about 15% retail. We've pedestrianized all the streets that we could, and we've worked really hard to kind of strengthen some of the things that are around us. And I think kind of having a city center that's historic is an amazing asset that we really kind of think Salisbury needs to embrace and find ways of using that. In Dublin, we've used the Easter Rising and some of the very historic buildings that we have to kind of achieve something similar. And we've tried to work with the local market. We have a very derelict local market that isn't really much of a muchness. I think it's very kind of, let's say, looked upon as something that kind of isn't really a kind of aspirational market anymore. We kind of said there's a lot of amazing things you can do with local market traders. And we've tried, I think we're doing the same in Chester now, to really work with the local market context and say the future of retail is not to have one more Primark or one of House of Fraser, one of the other chains. It's about having local and specialized retail units, and they can be quite open, they can be quite flexible, they don't have to be high-paying units. And they need to be centered around really active public spaces. And that's where we need councils to help. We need councils to really kind of create public spaces that those kind of retailers can sit around. So what we've said to the developer, the scheme shouldn't be one scheme. It should be 6 or 7 different buildings with quite different uses sitting above retail ground floor. So there is still retail in the scheme, but everything that sits above here is very different uses. There's 2 hotels, a really cheap one and a really expensive one. There is a kind of rework type office space, there's slightly more corporate office space. There's a real mix of different uses. There's very different retail uses. And there's affordable retail, there's student housing, there's affordable housing, and there are townhouses and there are expensive apartments in there. Because I think it needs all of those elements in the town center to make retail survive. Retail is, in a way, a place-making device. It isn't an anchor anymore. Retail can make an office building amazing. It can inform how the public space works, but retail itself shouldn't be looked upon as something that makes money. Retail is here to actually support a city center that we all want to spend time in, that we want to live in, and that we want to come to work. And that, I think, for us, is one of the most exciting things about COVID. I think in retail terms, it has only accelerated the questioning of how retail works. But in terms of how we work as individuals going to work, it has really kind of put into question this idea of commuting and how do you live and how do you work and how far do those things have to be apart. And that for us in Dublin, in London, and other places, we think is really exciting to actually say, I might be coming into town for 2 or 3 days. I might be working from home 2 or 3 days. That is a really interesting opportunity for smaller retail to thrive again, because what happened in many of the places that people are commuting away to work, they're driving with 5 minutes in a car to somewhere where they can't actually engage with the high street anymore. And if we can provide spaces for people to work in town centers so that they don't have to sit in their bedrooms to work or the living rooms or their kitchens, if they could actually work 2 or 3 days of the week, not going to the big corporate headquarters or the employer, but actually working in an office space that is shared, surrounded by good cafes, surrounded by good retail restaurants, supported by really good spaces, public space and streets. We think that's actually what the future of retail is and what the future of retail can be in terms of making those kind of experiences quite special. And I think what this shows in Dublin, I think we've just worked much more with existing fabric, reusing and repurposing, not building much new things, but taking old cinemas and converting them into new spaces and working with the market traders and other people there to actually just lift their game and just make them into places that really become retail destinations without it having to be a national brand or a kind of Primark kind of entity that I have to kind of draw from afar. I hope that's useful as a very first kind of introduction as kind of what we think the future of retail in town centers could be. And I think I'm sure there will be many more questions from you afterwards.
Thank you very much, Friedrich. That was really interesting, really useful to get those examples, those very real examples, and also refreshing to hear somebody talk about the exciting opportunities of COVID, because we haven't seen many of those. But thank you very much, Friedrich. I'm sure we'll come back to those. Now I'd like to hand over to David and Andrew, who are a bit of a double act. So David and Andrew, can you make your presentation, please, now?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sebastian. And just first of all, I'd like to say thank you to Salisbury Civic Society and Wiltshire Creative for inviting us tonight to speak. So my name is David Dolman. I'm Head of Development, Hayes Developments. I'm going to talk a bit about our company and the background surrounding the biophilic living development we're working on in Swansea. Then I'll hand over to Andrew Nixon from Powell Dobson Architects, and he'll run through some of the specific details of the development. So a quick overview of Hayes. So we're a Swansea-based development company founded by Carwyn Davis in 2007. We work across sort of multiple sectors: residential, commercial, and industrial. But in recent years, our focus has been directed towards regeneration and innovative projects that tackle some local and global issues. So I won't go into the full journey behind the biophilic living project, because it's going to take too long, but essentially about 3 or 4 years ago, we started speaking to Swansea University's Centre for Sustainable Aquatic Research and Life Sciences departments, talking to them about incorporating some of their research features into our developments. So the concept's really grown from this point. So just to talk about the development quickly, so if we go back a couple of slides, Andrew, sorry, to talk about the development in a nutshell. So it's a mixed use regeneration development that will provide 50 residential units, about 30,000 square foot of commercial space with some ground floor retail, along with rooftop amenity space, an urban farm, and an educational exhibition centre as well. So, and we're incorporating biophilic design and an emphasis on reconnecting humans with nature, well-being and community. So yeah, as we go on to the current slide, I actually read, I'd like to say a bit, I read a quote from one of our partners who's Professor Herbert Girardet today, which I think sums up part of the problem that we face at the moment. So what Herbert has said is the central contradiction we currently face is this: humanity is building an urban future, yet urbanization in its current form is threatening the very future of humanity and the natural world. So if we go, yeah, just looking at the slide here, so we've got the main issues. So we've got global issues like the impact of health and life, floods and droughts, so it's climate change, we got food and energy supplies, there's poverty and inequality in general. Sorry. Apologies, hang on, sorry. Yeah, so there's the three main drivers: the unprecedented global climate emergency we're facing, the pandemic caused by COVID-19, and the quick growth in urban population. So if we can go on to the next slide. Andrew, sorry, if we, yeah, so currently there is legislation out there, sorry, apologies. Yeah, so we got legislation out there, the Climate Change Act of 2008, Environmental Act of Wales, Sustainable Development Goals, etc. So as a private developer, these additional legislative requirements can negatively affect the viability of schemes by adding capital costs. So our scheme, we're trying to prove that the benefits of enhanced environmental and well-being features outweigh the additional capital costs. And the way to prove this really is by monitoring the outputs from the development. So next slide, Andrew, please. So the UN have produced the Sustainable Development Goals, so our project focuses on 4 of these goals, which include the good health and well-being. So we're registering our scheme with a health and well-being accreditation process, which is called the WELL accreditation. So it's a little bit like BREEAM, but it goes above and beyond that. So it looks more into the well-being of people, monitoring air quality, people's health, water quality, etc. Then one of the other targets of ours is affordable clean energy. So our scheme will include sustainable technologies such as integrated PVs, battery storage, efficient heating systems, and we've got an energy provider which will deal with energy profiling, sustainable communities. So the project includes a rooftop amenity space with greenhouses, so an urban farm which incorporates an aquaponics system. So the premise of this is that it creates a rooftop community where people can meet together and become more carbon conscious, reconnects them with nature, so addresses some loneliness and well-being issues as well. And then the fourth one there is climate action. So we have a green strategy for the building. So there's a lot of vertical green walls. We got rainwater gardens. We're reusing a lot of rainwater in grey water, irrigation of planting, etc. So our water runoff is much reduced, which deals with some of the flooding issues which we're faced at the moment. So yeah, as Andrew moved on there to so in Wales we have the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So this has 7 key features, which is creating a more prosperous Wales, a resilient Wales, a healthier Wales, a more equal Wales, a Wales of cohesive communities, a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, and globally responsible Wales. So this sets a bit of a framework for us to target, and that's what our project focuses on as well. So we just move on to the next one. So the IHP. So how we've been able to develop this scheme. So the Welsh Government launched an innovative housing programme which is funding available for innovative projects. So this was opened up to the private sector in 2018. So we've applied for this, the innovation funding. So they're 100% funding all the innovative features of this development. So as part of that, we're then going to monitor, as I said earlier, the outputs of the development and try and prove the value of innovation and take in the strain off other social services. So that's in a nutshell, that's the scheme. And I'm going to let Andrew talk through the detail of that in more detail going forward. Sorry, Andrew as well. Sorry, has shared this here. These are some of our partners we've been working on as we've gone through this journey. So we got Peter Head, who is from Ecological Sequestrian Trust, Professor Herbert Girardet, who I mentioned earlier, who is a co-founder of the World Future Council, consultant to the UNEP and UN Habitat. We got the Swansea University Centre for Sustainable Aquatic Research. So that's Paul Howes, Jeff Prophet, and Ian Mabbers. And then there's obviously ourselves and Powell Dobson's our partners as well. Okay, yeah, so as I said, I'll hand over to Andrew and he will talk through the details of the project. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dave. My name's Andrew Nixon from Powell Dobson Architects. I'll carry on with the presentation. I do apologise, there's a little bit of a delay because I'm actually trying to run the slideshow on behalf of both of us, so I do apologise for the delay. We've also missed out on a little video, which perhaps we'll come back to later on at the end. Okay, just very briefly, I'm Andrew Nixon. I'm a director of Powell Dobson. You've actually had an introduction to me, so well on this very long. My colleague Marta Lopez is actually hanging around. She is the lead designer, and she's also here in case I have an internet problem. So just quickly, our response is going to cover a few particular areas to do with the project. Obviously, it's about community and placemaking. We'll have a little look at innovation with the project, and clearly one of the key drivers is the well-being. You've probably seen this image already. Hopefully that's come up on the screen as a little bit of an introduction. It's a sort of, it's the view that we've taken, and it helps in many ways to actually explain the scheme. We're using the word biophilic to describe the scheme, but maybe I'm assuming by now everybody's familiar with the term. It does seem to have got into general parlance, but bio is life, philia is to do with feeling, friendly feeling towards. So it's actually really about our relationship with nature. And biophilic design is this sort of holistic approach to design aimed at restoring people's relationship to the natural world. This is not new. This is actually good design practice, but I think what's happening now is much more emphasis and focus on the well-being benefits, and so we're able to actually use it as a driver for some of the design change that we're doing. Fundamentally, this project is about community. We can talk about the greening, we can talk about all the clever things that we're going to do with this scheme, but fundamentally this is about the community. This is a small project in the context of the overall city centre of Swansea. But what we're trying to do here is if you like, is a micro version of the city by actually having people living, working and playing in this area. So it is about creating a sustainable community. It's about living sustainably. It's also about, you'll see a bit later, we've got this cooperative shared ownership model, which is going to be part of how the people live there. Through the built form, we're going to be able to show you how we've been able to accommodate some quite interesting roofscapes and actually an urban farm. And it is also about creating this community interest company, which will ensure that the project lives well beyond the bricks and mortar phase. And it's also about having access to food, social care, learning, amenity and transport. So it is actually a key and a very important project for the city. As with any project, everybody knows there's always lots of people involved. I'll just put this one up just to show you that I might be talking today, but actually there's lots of people behind this project, and they're not just professional consultants. There's a whole mixture of people here, and we're employing research students. We've got communications going on with a local community farm. We've got experts in various sectors to do with aquaponics. We've got consultancy in green infrastructure. And I think importantly, we're actually got very good relationships with at least 2 of the universities to help us through this process. So it's a big team effort. Swansea, just in case you aren't sure where it is, if you're in Paddington, it always comes up on the train timetable, but we're just about the far end of the M4. We do benefit from a fantastic bay, which you can see there. Just zooming in a little bit, Friedrich very kindly mentioned that he had a project in Swansea. I should point out that Friedrich's project is a major project for Swansea and is actually spearheading a whole regeneration effort. Most people are, well, everybody is welcoming the change that his project is actually bringing about. Our project is a little bit more modest, and it's actually where the dotted red line is towards the north end of the city there. And you can see our version of Oxford Street. Actually, Oxford Street is actually historically one of Swansea's main shopping streets, but of course that's all changing. I've put this slide up next, so you can see it. It's actually an overlay from a very important piece of legislation that is about to hit Swansea. It's gone through its draft consultation phase and is now about to become a supplementary planning guide. And it is actually how the city has a green infrastructure strategy. And there will be all sorts of issues that new developments will have to comply with. But interestingly, we just sit just outside their key driver area. But obviously we're adopting many of the sentiments and obviously the project is very welcome. I'm just going to go back ever so slightly. Is one thing that Swansea does benefit from being essentially built post-war is a lot of flat roof buildings, and we actually flagged this up back in 2014. Not only are those all potential green spaces, which is a phenomenal amount of floor area or a surface area for a city, the majority of those buildings, or a good percentage of those buildings, are actually in council ownership. So this is where you start having discussions with your local council about the opportunities that could be created. So it's not just about the green that can be done at ground level through the strategy I just mentioned, but it's also about what can we do with these roof spaces. And of course, the project that we've got is actually capitalising on it as best as possible. It was part of a little initiative with the art, with various artists in Swansea, and it was billed as the city rooftop project. But it was really just about opening people's eyes to the fact that we've got plenty of opportunity with existing buildings to do something positive. Okay, let's turn to the project. The project actually being a true regeneration project, we are not demolishing the building, we are going to repurpose it. It currently says it's Poundland, but in actual fact, it's the original Woolworths building that was built in the 1960s. And we are looking to regenerate that and repurpose it going forward. There are key strategies in place for the city at this particular point where they want to see more living and working. So as Friedrich quite rightly pointed out, there's now a big shift away from retail being the core anchor, and very much they've decided this part of the city should be focusing on living and working. So we fit neatly into that process. They're also tackling the transportation issues. Swansea actually has got plenty of places to park, so it was actually quite good of them to actually identify that the car park that's actually immediately behind our building is now free for a development opportunity. And this is what we're now looking to actually do. So here's our project, just in context. Hope you can see that. The dotted red line is actually our site, the existing building. We are surrounded by a city block. You can probably see there the sort of red hatch. Actually, we're also on the adjacent to a conservation area with a few listed buildings. But importantly, we've got an old car park behind us, which allows us to actually look at how we could regenerate the building. And there's also a little note there saying former Oceana building. That's actually been demolished and has been made way for a new tech hub. So all of a sudden, we've actually got quite a lot of potential activity happening around us with the project, all aligned to the new ideas. This is a funny little section through the building. I hope you can understand this, but it's actually a section taken right through the middle of the building, showing on the right-hand side Oxford Street, our shopping street. Waterstones is actually a bookshop in a listed building, and we've got the car park at the behind. The reason I'm showing this is just to show it's easier for me to show you and describe what the building's about. So when I click that on, hopefully that will come up in a second. What we're actually doing is extending upwards from the existing building, layering back, partly to do with the requirements of the listed building, but also to do with the constraints of what we can actually impose structurally on top of the existing building. And then we're building actually on part of the car park at the back with the new tower. This allows us then to get a completely mixed use development. So we're going to be retaining some retail, although that's going to be repurposed in a different way. We don't envisage there being a new big major space occupier. At that point, we've got commercial, which sits in is sandwiched in the middle, and then we've got the residential, which sits above it all. And as you can see there with the note, we've got this urban farm. So we're taking advantage of the section stepping back to actually introduce a vertical urban farm. That's where we sit. The yellow area you can see is the two sort of public realm areas. So we've got an opportunity with actually just outside the front of the building, but mainly we've got an opportunity with what's called on this drawing Picton Yard. We've got the same problem that Bristol's got with the word Colston. That name will be changing, but just for the moment, you might see the word Picton Yard appearing through the scheme. This is a new piece of public realm, which our building is going to be adjacent to. And again, we're looking at opportunities to actually enhance the area. There's a rather drab looking building on the left-hand side, which I can actually now tell you there's actually planning consent has been granted for a much grander building. So all of a sudden, this project has now got rooted in a new piece of public realm and activity, which is, again, one of the key areas that's important to actually deliver a sustainable community project. We've been asked by the planners to ensure that the building actually acts as a bit of a beacon to actually attract people to this part of the city. So the height is actually helping us with that. And then just to recap quickly, we've got retail that's happening on the ground floor. We've also got an opportunity at the rear, which is actually a cafe and education space. We're doing what we can to enhance and improve the front facade of the building. We're fortunate the building actually sets back from the street line, so we can actually got an opportunity to create a bit more of a square going forward. We are limited in what we can actually do with the local authority, but we shall be continuing to strive to do a little bit more in that space to actually create a proper square. We've got a sandwiched area of commercial space. It's a big footprint. The building itself is actually quite large. So one of the things that we actually want to do, and we are doing, is actually excavating part of the building. We're knocking through to form courtyards. This now enables us to provide commercial space that can have passive ventilation, but it also means that we can bring that biophilic element right into the commercial office space as well. So nobody is actually very far away from that connection to both outside air, daylight, and obviously vegetation. The top then is actually given over to the residential. And just to put a little bit of context, I'm not quite sure how quickly these slides are flying through. But what we've actually got is a situation that from the roof of the existing building is where the residential starts. So everyone will actually get the view of Swansea Bay. We're also looking to we've set the plan in such a way that we can access each of these stepping back layers. So there's all sorts of communal amenity space that is available on the several layers, and it's all accessible by the residents. I won't spend too much time on the actual flat types, but just to make a point that biophilia actually doesn't end with with the green spaces externally. It's also about the use of natural materials throughout. It's access to external space, daylight, fresh air. And of course, every single apartment will have its own balcony with a view out to the bay. We will also be incorporating planters into the scheme, which will be part of the community interest company's action to look after them on behalf of the residents. Okay. The urban farm is probably the bit that most people seem to be interested in. How on earth are we actually going to incorporate all this? We're taking advantage clearly of the stepping back. We've got a vertical section with the greenhousing. We've also got community greenhousing, which is for the residents, and we've also got these areas of allotments, if you like, and also just simple gardens. So we're basically taking advantage of every single square metre of roof space to make it accessible and also green. For those who don't know, it's actually going to be based around an aquaponics system, which means there are fish involved. The fish tanks that we have are actually part of an education resource, which are going to be down on the ground floor of the tower. And then through the various irrigation systems and feed systems will actually provide the nutrients needed into the greenhousing. We've done all sorts of calculations so far, and we're working with specialist consultants here to establish the amount of yield that we're going to be able to get from the greenhousing. And this is going to be partly run by the community interest company that will be set up alongside the project. It's commercial with a little c. The point of it is to be able to produce enough quantity to actually wash its face as an operation. By no means is this intended to be a full-blown commercial operation. One of the things that the council, I think I mentioned earlier, is to do with the green infrastructure strategy for Swansea. They're very keen and to ensure that all new developments actually comply with a certain criteria. You'd have thought with the amount of green space that we've got on our roof that it will actually be relatively straightforward, but believe it or not, the greenhouses don't count. However, we have actually calculated it all, and we're comfortably within the guidelines that have been set down by Swansea. Various other cities are now adopting a similar green space factor tools. It started in Southampton, and there will be other cities that are coming online. It's definitely something to look at. It's because it actually puts some policy behind ensuring that you actually get green space onto your buildings. It doesn't end there. We're also solving all our surface water runoff as well as part of this. We're fortunate in that we will not be delivering any water runoff into the sewers, so we're actually it's actually a zero contribution to that, so that actually we help with other developments around us. And it's going to very quickly, because we are running out of time, is that obviously this project doesn't end there. We have things, you've probably heard some of these terminology, but we do have a biosolar roof. It's obviously integrated with photovoltaics. They're actually helping to run the irrigation systems, and also makes a contribution to the battery system, which actually works for the residential properties as well as the commercial. We're using air source heat pumps to do this ambient temperature loop. That means this only really works. It works well when you've actually got two completely different uses in the building because their demands are at different times. This is why this project works particularly well, because we've got commercial offices at the lower level and retail, a little bit of retail, and then we've actually got the residential on the upper levels. They kind of work in a symbiotic way, which means that the energy, a very energy efficient project. We're also doing little tricks, like, for example, using sprinkler tanks. In Wales, every residential property has to have a sprinkler system. So we've got big tanks where we're just using it as a thermal store. As you would expect, lots of smart metering, Internet of Things, a lot of data gathering is all key. And we are doing a number of things in terms of waste strategy on the site. And perhaps the big one, which we may not be able to bring to fruition on this particular project, is that we're looking at with Swansea University about using algae technology to actually break down human waste. That's for a project to come next. So just to recap, well-being, we've got communal amenity, private amenity, and we've obviously got food production as part of our, if you like, access to nature. And it was mentioned earlier by Dave that we're actually using this WELL 2 certification, which, if you look at those areas there, in terms of air, water, nourishment, light, movement, thermal comfort, sound, materials, mind, community, innovations, these aren't what you normally expect to see in terms of how you accredit a building. We're moving into a new phase, and it's really important, I believe, going forward, that all buildings are actually measured against these criteria. And I just like to finish off is that whilst this is a building project, generally speaking, building projects will last the 1 or 2 years it takes to construct, and then you might have like a defect period for a year after, and then everybody walks away. That's not the case with this. It's a joint venture, so the building side of it is just one aspect. We're actually planning a 5-year phase where people who've been involved in the creation of the project actually help set up the community interest company. And as people start to become owners, occupiers, including the commercial space, they will eventually take over from the 5th year on and continue to run the community interest company.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you very much, David. That was absolutely fascinating, particularly interesting about, as you say, the urban farm. I was waiting for your description about that. I was wondering if there would be livestock up there, but clearly not. But thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. Some really interesting presentations. Lots of thought-provoking ideas there. So now we're going to open out the discussion to the audience for any questions, any comments. Councillor Jeremy Nettle and Carwyn Davis will also join the panel now to help us answer any of those questions. We've got some questions coming in. The first question is, which I'm going to direct in the first instance to Andrea, is how under the present planning system, Andrea, can we ensure that large-scale housing developers include environmentally friendly measures such as the ones that David has mentioned? How can we ensure they do actually include those?
Well, the neighborhood plan will go a long way towards that. So the neighborhood plan can set out specific policies about how housing development should proceed. We obviously have a difference between greenfield sites where we could do much more sort of innovative things, but most of Salisbury is in the conservation areas, whereas the Civic Society is very well aware, it's very, very difficult to do anything. And I think that, I mean, sort of if I could just bring it back to what Friedrich was saying, I think retail is really changing a lot. And so I walked around Salisbury the other day when we did our site visits, and I noticed how many tiny shops that were originally, you know, they're sort of, 100 years old, 200 years old in some cases. Tiny shops are now vacant. The buildings are being sold, and they've got small bits of residential possibilities upstairs. So we've got these like changes in the use classes order, which means that those can very easily switch over to residential without much difficulty. However, because they're in the conservation area, it will be very, very difficult to introduce any of these wonderful measures that we just heard about in the biophilic sphere. The biophilic project is fascinating, but it requires quite a large piece of land and a large building and a very large budget, I suspect. So in Salisbury, in the city center, I think we're really hampered by the restrictions of the conservation areas. Out in the wider area of Salisbury, so if we look at any greenfield sites where they would be developed, then yes, we can actually require that more happens. However, once again, planning is a blunt tool for increasing the performance, the environmental performance of buildings. And I think that's what we just heard about with the biophilic sphere. So in that one, the developer actually wanted to introduce these projects, and you saw how many partners were involved, and I'm sure that there was quite a lot of grant support and a very, very innovative approach, which is wonderful. Planning cannot make those things happen. Planning can only set the ground rules for how development proceeds, and unfortunately, planning is limited by building control, which is very unambitious. So the government is proposing to make dramatic changes, we're told, in the new white paper. And the first thing I hope that they're going to look at is how planning can actually require more ambitious approaches to climate change management. And I think that's what the biophilic project really is. It's a really exciting project, and it would be great. We also have a Woolworths building in Salisbury that's sort of teetering on the edge there with retail on the bottom that might not last. And I'm certainly going to be finding out more about this biophilic project and seeing if we can put together a partnership there. But the point I'm trying to make, and I'm sorry if my answer is rather long, is that planning can do very little, but it can try its best for greenfield sites, and we will do that. And for larger sites that have more capacity to make a profit for whoever is investing their money in it, let's be honest. But what I'm worried about in Salisbury is the fact that so much of it is actually in the conservation area. So many of those buildings are now sort of not in a good condition. The ones I was looking at and photographing, these tiny little shops with the tiny little 3 rooms above, which could very easily transform into housing. But forcing those to be environmentally sustainable, I think will be a really big challenge. And it's going to take more than planning policy to do that. It's going to take will, and it's going to take a lot of investment. I'll stop there because I'm sure other people want to say something too.
Thank you, Andrea. Well, I think this is a wonderful moment to draw in Councillor Nettle, leader of Salisbury City Council. So obviously, Councillor Nettle, you've heard many wonderful ideas, many exciting projects. How do you think that is going to inform the council in terms of their plans for the Salisbury Neighbourhood Plan?
Yes, I think very exciting. I was very interested to what's been happening, and certainly Frederick's presentation was very much in line with a lot of thoughts, my personal thoughts. The high street obviously is changing. We all know that, and it was changing before Novichok, and I think that we saw that, and we came through that recovery. We were working through that recovery program, and what we knew then was the vitality of the city centre is extremely important, and what we do need is more housing in the centre. I think that the large shops, has been said by various presenters, in the high street is not going to happen. It is the dinosaur, sadly. What we have in Salisbury is lots of independent shops, which is excellent, and we've got to maintain them. The only way we can maintain those is we've built a lot of accommodation for elderly people. Now we need to focus on accommodation for younger people. And the idea of reversing the change of coming into a city centre to work, the concepts that you've heard in this presentation is about working in the city centre and living in the city centre. And that does a number of things. What it does, of course, is increase the whole spending power for other organisations, other businesses who want to come invest. It does bring investment in. And I think that's the critical part. So if we can get more accommodation for younger people. And what is interesting, the Civic Society has done this, is we walk around Salisbury, as Andrea has mentioned, and we tend to look at the ground floor. If we look up to the first floor, the work that we did with Wiltshire Council has identified over 200 over 200 apartments, flats that could be vacated. So we do need that investment. We need to talk to the landlords. The landlords, excuse me by saying, is they need to wake up and smell the coffee, because retail is changing. And if we can combine accommodation with retail, what we do is open up the city centre. We actually need to then look at what I won't call it the nighttime economy, I'll call it the evening economy is, because what we are seeing is fairly obvious. People are coming in, families are coming in for entertainment. And in fact, in our survey that went out to the community, we saw, number one destination is the Playhouse. Number two destination is the Odeon Cinema. Number three is the Art Centre. And what we have seen is that both our Market Square and the library are actually fairly poorly used. I'm not saying we should get rid of them. What I'm saying is we've got to change the dynamics. So because of COVID, we can't use the Playhouse at the moment in the way that we used to, and these other places. And so we do need to change. And one of those ways is start doing what we've heard in these presentations. So very exciting.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Nettle. That was really interesting. And I'm going to come back to one of your points in a minute with Friedrich, actually. But there's a question that's come in for David and Andrew. Is how is, and you could decide each of you who wants to start, but how is affordable housing achieved in Swansea, the Swansea Bio project? The residential area looks quite expensive. Is affordable housing possible?
Yes, I guess in short. We have, Andrea's touched on it there, we received the IHP grant funding. So they've funded 100% of the innovation. So Andrew mentioned that we've got like district heating systems and things like that have been paid for by the IHP, and that helps spread the cost across the units. I think also it being a mixed use development helps us share some of the substructure and structural costs of the tower across all units. It was a challenge to get it within. So in Wales, we have a thing called the Acceptable Cost Guide, which is a Welsh government tool dictating how much you can spend on affordable housing. So it was a challenge to get it within their guide, but we did just about do it. But yeah, as I said, it's because we split it across the mixed use scheme, and we've had some grant funding as well.
Should point out though that all the residential is actually going to a social housing provider, and they are actually going to be offering back to the market various different tenures. So there will be, pure affordable housing for rent, and there will be sort of shared ownership model as well. So we're actually working with Pobl. Might be a name you haven't come across, but they are one of the leading social housing providers in Wales. So it's been a joint venture with them. As Dave quite rightly pointed out, clearly we perhaps wouldn't be where we are today with this project without this additional Welsh Government funding. And it's very much a pilot project. But if we don't try out these opportunities, we won't actually get to the point where we can make them cost-effective solutions. So we fully expect that we're going to, this is a job that we're learning on. And we will work out the best way to do these things to a point when we can introduce some, but maybe not all these systems on every project that we do without the need for any additional government support. That's the target. But if we don't start with a project, we'll never know where we can get to with it. So we are extraordinarily grateful to the Welsh Government for their intervention on this. And they've seen that we're onto something here, so they want to support it.
Thank you very much. That's really, really useful to know. And a question that I have for Friedrich, which is something that Councillor Nettle touched on. You talked very coherently, Friedrich, about the way that, we all understand this, that retail has changed hugely, and actually retail can't be the only driver for regeneration and change in cities. You didn't talk much about culture. Obviously, I was delighted that that Councillor Nettle mentioned the Playhouse as one of the hotspots of the city. Just wanted to understand a bit more from you about how you see culture as where it sits in regenerations in the way we look now at city regeneration.
So there's a big difference, I think, in how that's dealt with in the UK to, I think, other countries in the European context. I think there's a much bigger emphasis outside the UK in using culture very strategically for regeneration purposes. I think in the UK we have generally kind of left a lot to the private market, and sometimes that can be private versions of culture, or it can be kind of slightly more supported, but not entirely kind of the government funded versions of culture. And so I think we haven't quite seen in the UK the same power that I think kind of you will in France or in Germany or sometimes in Italy, you will find where culture is extremely kind of strategically placed as a major kind of key or element of regeneration. I think that's kind of, it's got a long history in the UK of just kind of, the government generally being a bit more reluctant to be, I think, kind of being seen to be doing regeneration itself. I think it's always left ideally where possible to the private market more. I think, I find that quite regrettable. I think in the moment, for example, we're working on Euston Station, and again, it's left to the private development sector to kind of define what the future of a train station is like, where I would also kind of say that's a national piece of infrastructure in the same way as a cultural building. That should be, the government putting its investment powers behind what the station can do. I think what we've tried to do in Dublin and what we're trying to do in Folkestone and what we're also trying to do in Wales is kind of using culture quite strategically. So I think what Andrew has mentioned, I think we're building Swansea Arena in Swansea. That is a really big move for Swansea. Swansea has put a lot of its own money and Welsh government funding into building a concert arena. We've done something similar in Leeds with Leeds Arena for Leeds City Council. And so these two councils were very much councils who kind of said, we're not getting the concerts that we should be getting as a town or as a city of our size. We're not on the concert circuit. there's a whole lot of evening economy that we don't have, because basically not enough people are coming to us on that, and nobody else is going to do it. We as Leeds and we as Swansea need to just do that ourselves. It's a big investment. It was a major investment for Leeds to get a 14,000 seat arena. Swansea is going to be a 3,500 seat arena. We hope it will make a fundamental difference to how Swansea will see its city centre, because the city centre has been very much, I think, as Andrew mentioned, the 1950s kind of post-war, kind of two-story kind of regeneration. You can partly blame the Germans, but not entirely. And I think kind of there's a monocultureness to the centre of Swansea, which is, I think, we're just at the very beginning of undoing that. So I think Andrew's project of putting residential back into Swansea city centre, building the arena, and us also kind of just building 2 new bridges to the beach, are kind of probably the kind of 3 main parts to get people to live there again, get people to kind of go there again on weekends and on evenings, and to just celebrate the natural parts of Swansea, the beach, that actually when you go to Swansea city centre, you'd never go to the beach. It just isn't part of your experience. You just, on Andrew's diagram, it's very clear that Swansea Bay is where Swansea is, but if you actually get to Swansea city centre on Oxford Street, you wouldn't have a clue in which direction the beach would be. And so I think culture is one of them. I think I'm wary of that being used too much, as I think in Chester and elsewhere we've not managed to find the funding for that. And I think kind of that's within the gift of richer councils to stem that on their own. I think in Swansea we really had to look very carefully at Cardiff and what we can get national Welsh funding for, because Swansea alone couldn't do it. And so I think in my experience we've very much tried to do schemes which don't rely so entirely on culture when we can avoid it, but I think rather, as I think Jeremy you've pointed out, if possible, just work harder with the culture we have and with the buildings and assets we have, rather than saying, I need just one more thing, and if I buy this one more thing, then everything is going to be fine. I think the other thing I just wanted to add to, I think what Andrea was saying, I think in my experience, when I was a student of architecture, we ran out of studio space in the architecture studio, and so I rented a fishmonger together with 4 friends, and I think we paid 100 marks at the time. That's kind of like £60 between us to just rent a fishmonger. And the Germans didn't quite have business rate taxes in the same way as we're used to it in the UK. But I think we've really enjoyed the sense of kind of sitting on the ground floor, being architecture students, trying to sell buildings to people passing by. And I think there's real potential, and I think that the buildings that Salisbury has and that Andrea has identified to kind of say, and that's what I was trying to say before with COVID, there's a real potential of the split we've had for the last 50, 60 years between living and working, that coming back into the city centre, but sometimes also into the same building, to actually kind of say, if I would be a lawyer, why, rather than sitting in my bedroom being kind of slightly claustrophobic in a 5-story apartment tower, why can't I have a small townhouse where actually on the ground floor with shop windows, I can be a lawyer and go upstairs and have a family life? And I think that is something that we would be really excited to see if that can be prescribed more into kind of legislation, if it can be kind of encouraged more, if we can work with councils and nationally on what business rates mean and how you can actually change how business rates are charged and what the assignments for spaces are. Because I think to us, it's really dangerous to wait for the big moves to kind of fund the big pieces of culture and say that's the only way things would move. Because I think between us, we've all worked for very long and very big projects, and they just take very long. And actually what city centres need is quite quickly help. And I think the smaller ones are the ones that we can actually do now or in the next 2-3 years.
Yes, and I share a lot of what you're saying, Friedrich. And culture isn't just about big, shiny new buildings as well. I mean, it obviously has been as well, and that can work. But it's not just about that. It's also about using the infrastructure already. And as you say, if people aren't coming into the city centres anymore for retail because they're doing so much online, but live performance is very difficult to replicate. It's just it's one thing that you could do in your leisure time, which is different from watching things online or whatever. So I think and what I've been really excited and delighted by is that, post Novichok, and that was a pretty grim experience for Salisbury, but both the City Council and the Wiltshire Council absolutely identified that as part of the recovery plan, culture needed to be a part of that. It was a driver of change. Andrea, you wanted to say something.
Yes, I very much agree with everything that Friedrich said, and he's given me much to think about today. I just wanted to, bring back the whole conversation to the neighborhood plan, because then we are actually at the point where we are trying to write new and different policies for Salisbury. And we have to acknowledge that the Woolworths building might be, no longer fit for purpose, that we have all of these small shops in the town center, that we've got a lot of car parking spaces that we have to, if we're all working from home, if we're all shopping online, do we need that many car parking spaces? Would they be better used for housing? Would they better be used for affordable housing? I noticed the biophilic project, it has a community infrastructure, that community interest company, running it. Very interesting. Could we do something on a car park with a social provider with retail underneath, sort of a mini biophilic project? We do have the capacity if we can get our landowners to be willing to work with us. But I think we just have to completely rethink how we use our urban center. First of all, I think culture is embedded in the very structure of Salisbury, and I think people come to culture for tourism, just to enjoy the beauty of the place and the amazing cathedral and the green spaces as well. So culture is not just about sort of formal culture; it's also about just the ambiance of the place. But with social distancing, 6 months ago, I would have thought what Frederick was saying about having sort of co-working spaces in the town center, so you could just sort of like work from home and then go in for your coffee and your meeting. But with COVID-19, that's a bit more problematic. How long is that going to last? Maybe it's not going to last very long. But we even the use of cafes, people are now using cafes in this informal way for outdoor working. So do we need to have more cafes, or do we need to have cafes that have photocopier machines with them and business, rentable offices? We really, really have to rethink how we use the space. Friedrich also said that there isn't any money, and we heard in Wales, that this wonderful project was heavily subsidized. I fear that moving forward, we're going to have much less money to spend. I think that this government is very much trying to centralize budgets. They've introduced in the white paper the concept of the infrastructure levy, where all of it sounds to me, reading it, that they're going to centralize all of the infrastructure funding and then distribute it back out. It's not going to be ring fenced for infrastructure, so that means it can support council budgets, so that means there's going to be less. I think we're going into a recession, there's going to be less tax being collected, and therefore there'll be less money to be handed out in grants or for building projects. So I think that Salisbury is going to have to save itself. I really do. It's a very bleak message, but I do. And we have to do that by being innovative and thinking outside the box and using our own resources to actually make these things happen. So these little small shops that are now derelict, actually, or not derelict, well, some of them are derelict, unloved, unused, unutilized, they actually might be the renaissance for the whole city, because they might be small projects that individual people can actually afford to upgrade. And what the neighborhood plan can do is actually provide the context for that change to happen in a positive way. So I've certainly learned a lot tonight, and I hope we can carry on this conversation because there's a lot more work to do. So thank you for letting me comment on Friedrich's comments.
Thanks very much, Andrea. Carwyn, can I bring you in? Because one of the challenges that Andrea sort of made is, could the biophilic living project be scaled down for a small city like Salisbury? I don't know how well you know Salisbury, but a small city. Could it be at all in any way?
Yeah, I think it has to be. I mean, one of the sort of objectives we've always seen with this project is we've got to, what are the risks to this concept? Okay, so the risks we identified when we sort of did the early stage appraisals were, we build all this garden space and nobody wants to be part of it. Okay, so it's important for us that we establish the community interest company, and that is fully engaged with by the residents and occupiers of the building. Okay, it won't work if nobody wants to be part of it. Okay, so that's risk number one, is we build all this structure and nobody's interested. Personally, I don't think that'll happen, but that is risk number one. Risk number two would be that they run out of money to keep it moving and running, keeping the scheme moving forward. Okay, So what we sort of had to look at, and I think sometimes we need to view financial models as well, in how we cater and look at how we manage these projects differently from how we historically have. So what we've done with the 40-odd thousand square feet of commercial, we've decided by the biophilic concept in the office space, we're going to have a system whereby extraction of the carbon produced by the occupants gets put back through the glass houses. Okay, so in that sense, then we will charge a rate that'll come off the rent for the commercial space. So that then generates an income stream, okay, which is key for the CIC to keep running. There will be costs of managing and maintaining the sort of infrastructure. So the actual office occupiers benefit from the removal of the carbon, and it's carbon friendly and it's climate change friendly processing through glass houses, which obviously plants absorb carbon, reduce the carbon that goes out into the atmosphere. Okay, so that is the positive we want to sell to the commercial occupier. We take, it'll maybe £1 a square foot, and that goes towards the CIC. So the CIC is funded. Okay, so ultimately what we're trying to reduce is the risk of they run out of money and it fails, because ultimately if you know, everything needs money to sustain it on a long-term basis. So there's an income stream we need to generate into that CIC. This is very much, the CIC I see has been key to how the concept truly works, okay, and the structure. We've spent a lot of time with legals and what have you over how can we get that income stream, get full engagement. I mean, most of our city centre allotments are oversubscribed, so that augurs well. We're trying to get away from charging people for using the glass houses, because we think we don't want to make this an exclusive middle class enclave, because that's not going to sort our climate change objectives out. We have to make it accessible to all. David said earlier that we are working with social housing providers. We're trying to work with where we do a mix of social, shared ownership and open market. So we get a mix of demographic, which I think is really important. I think the last thing we want is we create one kind of demographic that occupies it. We want it to be spread. We want the age profile to be wide. So it truly creates regeneration, but integrates communities. Hopefully the benefits of that can be economic and societal as well, in the sense that people feel part of the community, that they may live next door to somebody who's in their 70s, or that they may live next door to some students or what have you. And it's just integrating. We need to do more of this integrating in our city centres. Swansea has had, over the last few years, as has Cardiff, and I'm sure many other cities across the UK, the student sector, whilst obviously having a demand, has driven a lot of the redevelopment. Okay, now my fear with student sector is we just create certain demographics in certain areas, and I'm sort of the mind sometimes that we seem to have produced too many. In certainly Swansea, there's a lot of new student schemes coming to Swansea. I think we need to look at mixing it all up and not having these kind of enclaves of student, enclaves of other sort of demographics. So I think that's really important. It needs to be integrated. We need to mix our communities up. We need to change the complete way we think. And I think funding, in the end, okay, we don't do this because, you know, our principles are that we want to change the world with the environment. We have to make money, okay? That's the reality and that's the truth of it, okay? So we can't undertake this scheme because we just want to do something really good for the planet, okay? We have to make some money. And I want this to be the first of many. So therefore, I probably spend more time than David and Andrew in trying to work out the financial model, how we can transfer that into a city like Salisbury. Generally, what we think is, to get the scale, we tend to think we need clusters of about 50 units, okay? That's where the demographic numbers are, that's what's throwing out for us, okay? Now, whether that's done, I know you nodded, Andrea, but whether that's done in one large building, doesn't mean we can't co-join and create streets and areas where we then add the biophilic concept to the street. You know, this is the world we need to revisit. We can't just yeah, we wouldn't come to Salisbury to do 2 or 3 flats. I'm not going to pretend to you. No, we wouldn't, because the viability wouldn't be there for us. Okay, so we need a scale and a quantum. Okay, now that could be 20 or 30 really nice, and you mentioned a Woolworths in Salisbury, Andrea. So it may well be that we can have a look at what could go there. But I think the important thing is biophilic can latch on to a listed environment as well. It doesn't need to be just for new structures or refurbished structures. Biophilic is more than just a bolt-on that only can go in certain environments. I think we need to sort of rethink that sort of idea, and that certainly we create streetscapes with more landscaping. The issue you'll come across then will be local authorities wanting how do they pay for the upkeep and what have you. So there again, we need to rethink that model. So that's something we've done on our building is to look at, okay, we've got to make sure this stands on its own 2 feet, being supported by the people who occupy that building, okay? And that's very much where we've come from. So I've got a long way around, Sebastian, but the answer is yes.
It's great. No, that's really brilliant. Thank you so much, Carmen. And said with such passion as well. We've got quite a few questions coming in, and I have to say there's not a lot of time left. So if I could ask you to be reasonably pithy now. Councillor Richard Kluwer, Deputy Leader of Wiltshire Council, asks that mentions or comments that he's concerned that Salisbury is in essence a market town with a cathedral and is reliant on the population around Salisbury to come into the city for economic vitality in the same way that other market towns do. How will the neighbourhood plan, do we think, take this symbiotic relationship into account? Who would like to answer that one? Andrea.
Well, it does have that kind of a relationship, and I've got lots of ideas. So there is a very large employer at Porton Down, for instance, and we're having a great difficulty actually contacting somebody there. But wouldn't it be nice if we could provide some of their accommodation and their temporary housing in Salisbury with maybe a shuttle bus or something like that? We are also going to be speaking to the neighboring parishes to see how we can work together on that. So yes, watch this space. It's a very complex answer. I can't give you a pithy response. I'm sorry, but we are looking at it, and talk to me more afterwards if you want.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Andrea. And I think probably one last question, which I'm going to direct to Councillor Nettle. What do you think? What do you think are the opportunities provided in the context of the conversation we're having? What do you think about the opportunities provided by the malting site?
I think that's a huge area, and just as Andrea said, I have emphasised having accommodation for younger people here. I think there is a need for that. When you look at the statistics from our community survey, that's the one thing that keeps coming out is buying their first being affordable housing, which I think is important. I think that re-looking at the maltings to try and give you a pithy answer with more accommodation on it, and possibly a new cultural unit in there to keep me happy, Sebastian, us all happy actually, not just you, would be a great way forward. And I think the ideas that we've seen this evening are absolutely fantastic. It is exactly what we want to do. And if we can just motivate ourselves to go forward on this, I think we can look to the future quite positively.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. We've got more questions, but I'm afraid we've answered all that we can. I'd like to thank all the panelists, Andrea Pellegram, Friedrich Ludwig, David Dolman, Andrew Nixon, Carwyn Davis, and Councillor Jeremy Nettle for all that fascinating and thought-provoking discussion. I'd also like to thank our audience for your stimulating questions. This open meeting has been a collaboration between the Civic Society, Salisbury City Council's Neighbourhood Plan team, and Wiltshire Creative. Thank you again to all the panellists and our audience for joining us today. Thank you also to those who have organised today's event. Nicola Lipscomb and Richard Dean from the Civic Society, Fiona Curtis, Michael Scott, and Amanda Bruce from Wiltshire Creative. We hope you found it as fascinating as we've done, that it will help inform the development of our Salisbury Neighbourhood Plan going forward. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Bye.